So imagine sitting in like a perfectly safe, quiet room.
Okay.
Nothing is actually wrong. You're just at your desk, maybe drinking a cup of coffee. But a coworker makes this really minor passing comment about a spreadsheet you formatted.
Right, something totally mundane.
Exactly. But suddenly your heart rate spikes to like 130 beats per minute. Your palms start sweating. Your vision narrows. In a fraction of a second, your body is reacting. Not to a critique of a spreadsheet, but as if someone just held a weapon to your head.
Yeah, full survival mode.
Right. And we have this really pervasive societal habit of blaming those specific moments on, like, a simple lack of self-control.
We really
We
do.
tell ourselves, I just need to be logical. I need to talk myself down. We blame our prefrontal cortex, the rational thinking part of the brain, for basically failing to keep the animal inside us on a leash.
Which is a very outdated way to look at it.
Exactly. And that's what we're getting into today. Because what if our fundamental accepted map of how the human brain handles chronic stress and trauma is just completely backward?
Well, the sources we're unpacking today suggest exactly that. I mean, we've been operating under a fundamentally flawed architectural map of the human mind under pressure.
A completely flawed map.
Right. We've been looking at the wrong mechanism, blaming the wrong network, and consequently trying to heal the system using tools that actually reinforce the damage.
Which brings us to the mission of this deep dive. Welcome, by the way. Today we are exploring this incredible stack of recent papers and source material detailing what they call the systems archaeology and the neurobiology of complex trauma.
It's fascinating stuff.
It really is. And our mission today is to correct a massive scientific misconception. We are shifting the focus entirely away from the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, and diving incredibly deep into the default mode network, or the DMN.
And that shit changes everything.
It changes literally everything. We're going to uncover how survival mechanics don't just make you scared, but they actually actively rewrite your fundamental sense of identity.
Yeah, who you believe you are.
Right. So if you've ever felt like you're fighting this invisible war inside your own head, or if you just want to understand the profound mechanics of how human beings adapt to chronically hostile environments, this deep dive is for you.
Absolutely.
And what's so refreshing about these papers is they strip away all the moral judgment. They eliminate the subjective, psychological jargon that usually makes people feel, broken or weak.
They replace all of that with basically the unyielding thermodynamics of the mind.
Thermodynamics of the mind. I love that phrase. It's so mechanical.
It is a purely mechanical, objective way to look at human suffering. I mean, the texts we're looking at today, they provide these architectural mappings of the traumatized self. They offer crucial corrections to older clinical models.
Right.
And they give us these incredibly detailed frameworks exploring something called structural dissociation. So we are moving away from looking at trauma as a hardware failure, like a broken brake line. And we're looking at it as a brilliant, albeit really exhausting software adaptation.
Okay, so to understand how trauma alters the system, we first have to understand the hardware and the software of the mind in its normal baseline state, right?
Man, start at the baseline, yeah.
And to do that, we need to expose this really persistent myth of the prefrontal ego, because I feel like every pop psychology book I've ever read frames the prefrontal cortex as the CEO of the brain.
Oh, universally. The CEO, the pilot, the captain of the ship.
Right. The idea is that your PFC is who you are. It's your identity, your consciousness, the thing maintaining your narrative continuity.
And that conventional wisdom says that if you have trauma, your PFC just gets overwhelmed by the amygdala, the fear center.
The classic weak PFC versus strong amygdala equation.
Exactly. And the sources provide a major, major correction to that exact assumption. The prefrontal cortex is absolutely essential, but it is merely the executive regulator.
Just the regulator.
Right. It's the top-down control layer. It handles planning, inhibiting impulses, organizing goal-directed action, and, modulating the emotional centers. But it is not the ego. It is not your narrative identity.
Okay, I want to push back on that for a second to really clarify this distinction. Because if I lose my ability to control my actions, like if my prefrontal cortex goes offline and I snap at someone, I certainly feel like I've lost myself.
It definitely feels that way in the moment.
So if the PFC isn't the core of who I am, what is it? Let's use an analogy. If the mind is a highly advanced self-driving car,
Okay, I like this.
the prefrontal cortex is the steering wheel and the braking system, right?
Exactly. It controls where the car goes in the immediate moment. It stops the car from hitting a pedestrian. It navigates the immediate obstacles. That maps perfectly onto the executive function. The PFC keeps the vehicle from crashing into the immediate environment.
Right, but the steering wheel doesn't know who owns the car. The braking system has no concept of, like, where the car was yesterday or where it's ultimately trying to arrive tomorrow. It has no memory, no destination. It just steers.
It just executes the immediate physical commands.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the system that actually knows the destination, the history, and the identity of the vehicle, that is the GPS system. And according to our sources, that GPS system is the default mode network, the DMN.
The prime identity core, that's what the sources call it, Node 1.
Node 1. This is the real star of the show. The DMN is the autobiographical self model. It handles your inner narration, mental time travel, and the continuity of the I across the past and the future.
And that distinction is really the linchpin of this entire new framework. The default mode network is the network most directly tied to that I, me, my story function.
So when I sit quietly and think about some embarrassing thing I said 5 years ago.
Which we all do.
Right. Or if I'm imagining a conversation I'm going to have with my boss tomorrow, that is the DMN lighting up.
Exactly. It is involved in self-reference, social simulation, and really the construction of your personal mythology.
Okay, so keeping with the vehicle analogy, if the PFC isn't the ego, if it's just the brakes, then losing control in a triggered moment isn't about losing yourself.
No, not at all.
You are losing control of the vehicle, but the GPS still knows exactly who you are and where it thinks you're going. The steering wheel locks up, but the DMN is what's actually defining what the journey means.
And that reframes so much of the guilt people feel. When someone says, oh, I lost myself in anger, they didn't lose their identity. They just lost their executive regulator.
Oh, wow.
But the DMN, the identity core, was actually still running the show the whole time, probably shouting that it was under attack.
That makes so much sense. So if we have the PFC as the executive regulator, the brakes, and the DMN as the prime identity core, the GPS, what are the other components of this map? Because when I get triggered, I don't feel it in my thoughts first.
Where do you feel it?
I feel it in my chest. I feel this massive physiological wave of panic before my brain even registers what's happening. So where does that sit in this architecture?
Well, you are describing the third crucial component, which the papers call the somatic sentinel.
Somatic sentinel.
Yes, node 2. The amygdala-insula axis, this is your bottom-up somatic alarm. The amygdala basically acts as the rapid scanner. It detects threat relevance in the environment way before you consciously process what you're looking at.
Like the classic evolutionary example of jumping back from a curved stick on a hiking trail?
Exactly.
Because your visual cortex hasn't processed stick yet, but your amygdala has already processed possible snake and made you jump.
Precisely. It operates exponentially faster than reflective thought. Because survival requires the body to react before the narrator even understands what's going on.
Right, if you wait to think about it, you get bitten.
Exactly. But the amygdala doesn't work alone here. It is paired with the anterior insula, which is a really fascinating piece of neurobiology. The insula tracks your internal bodily states, a process called interoception.
Interoception, okay.
Yeah, it monitors your heart rate, your digestion, your muscle tension. So when the amygdala detects a threat, it signals the body to react, and the insula reads that sudden physiological disturbance.
Oh, I see.
And it converts it into a felt sense of urgency. It translates biological data into the conscious emotion of dread, disgust, or panic.
Okay, so the amygdala is the motion detector on the outside of the house, and the insula is the siren blaring inside the living room.
That is a perfect way to look at it. And that brings us to the fourth layer, which manages the relationship between all these other systems. The selective boundary.
The boundary.
Yes. In the neurobiological literature, this is called the salience network, or cortical limbic gating system. Think of it as the ultimate switching mechanism.
Okay.
It decides what matters right now. It's constantly mediating between the bodily alarm of the amygdala insula, the self-referential thought of the DMN, and the outward attention directed by the PFC. It is the physical and informational boundary of conscious relevance.
So it's the filter.
Exactly. It's the filter.
It decides if the sound of a twig snapping outside is just the wind, which it filters out as background noise so you can keep reading your book.
Right.
Or if it's a predator, which it lets through the gate to trigger the alarm and force your DMN to pay attention.
Yeah, and in a healthy, stable system, this boundary protects the entire integrated field of consciousness from overload. It prevents your system from treating every single piece of sensory data as a life or death scenario. It allows intention to move into action efficiently.
Okay, so we have a completely redrawn map now. Let me just summarize to make sure we've got it. The PFC is the brakes and steering. The DMN is the autobiographical GPS and narrator.
Yes.
The amygdala insula is the somatic alarm, and the salience gating is the filter.
That's the architecture.
This all makes perfect sense for a normal, functioning system. But the central question of these papers is what happens to this architecture under the weight of trauma, right?
Yeah.
What happens when this perfectly balanced system is subjected to chronic, inescapable threat?
What the sources refer to as external entropy. Yeah.
External entropy. So what breaks first?
Well, this is where we really have to discard the old clinical models entirely. The old model dictated that trauma was simply a failure of the prefrontal cortex to exert control over a hyperactive amygdala.
Framing trauma as a failure of inhibition.
Exactly.
The implication being that if you just tried harder, if you did enough cognitive behavioral therapy to strengthen your logic, you could just force the animal brain to calm down.
Which is a model this sources unequivocally dismantle.
Thank goodness.
Right, because it doesn't work. The new corrected equation of trauma is infinitely more complex and, frankly, profound. The equation they give is trauma equals limbic somatic alarm plus altered salience detection plus disrupted executive regulation plus, and this is the foundational shift, DMN self-model capture.
DMN self-model capture. Okay, I really want to spend significant time on this because it feels like the pivotal revelation of this entire stack of research.
It really is.
Because the core issue of complex trauma isn't that you just feel scared all the time. It's that unresolved threat cannot be integrated into the default mode network without fundamentally destabilizing your entire sense of I.
Exactly. Let's trace the sequence of a traumatic environment to see how this capture actually occurs in real time. Imagine a child growing up in a chronically neglectful or emotionally volatile household.
Okay.
The environment is unpredictable. The body detects danger constantly through the amygdala-insula axis. That somatic sentinel fires daily.
So the siren in the living room is always going off.
Always. And the salience system, the boundary,
Yeah.
accurately marks this danger as highly important. But here is the crux of the problem. Because the threat is chronic and the individual is a dependent child, the threat is inescapable.
Right, the prefrontal cortex cannot just fix it, fight it, or run away. The brakes and steering wheel cannot drive a 7-year-old out of the house.
No, they can't. You are trapped in the vehicle. Therefore, the threat material cannot be processed into a completed action. It just remains active. It gets pushed up the hierarchy. And the default mode network, whose entire job is to create a coherent narrative of reality, folds this chronic state of alarm directly into your identity.
Oh, wow.
The ego, which is desperately trying to make sense of a chaotic world, begins to say, this is me, this is my story, this is the fundamental nature of reality.
So the person isn't merely remembering the danger as a past event. The self-model actually begins to interpret memory and expectation and relationships entirely through the architecture of danger.
The sources phrase this dynamic beautifully. They say, the wound gains a story. The nervous system's alarm becomes woven into the identity model itself.
The trauma doesn't just feel frightening, it becomes the lens through which the person perceives their own existence.
Exactly. It becomes who they think they are.
The wound gains a story. I mean, let's look at what that actually sounds like in someone's head. If you grow up in that volatile house where you are constantly criticized, your amygdala is constantly alarming.
Constant state of threat.
Right. And eventually, your DMN, your narrator, doesn't just say, I am currently in a dangerous house and I need to be careful. The DMN generalizes the threat to create a predictable map of reality.
Yes, it draws a larger conclusion.
It says, I am inherently flawed. I am unlovable. The world is a place where people will eventually turn on me, so I must anticipate betrayal. The threat becomes entirely self-referential.
This perfectly illustrates why we are dealing with a software adaptation, and not just a broken piece of hardware. The author terms this a recursive capture of consciousness.
Recursive capture.
Yeah, and the tragic irony here is that the system is actually functioning exactly as it was designed to under chronic threat.
Wait, you mean it's doing its job?
It's doing its job.
Yeah.
It is attempting to predict the environment to keep the organism alive. If the DMN believes you are unlovable, it prevents you from seeking connection, which protects you from the devastating pain of the rejection it assumes is absolutely inevitable.
Oh, man. So it's protecting you by isolating you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the result is that the identity loop explains everything through fear. You aren't just fighting an external threat anymore. Your consciousness is trapped within an identity loop that simulates threat in every single interaction.
Okay, so if the DMN, the core narrator of your life, is under absolute siege by this traumatic material, how does the mind keep the I from completely shattering?
Right? How do you not just fall apart?
Yeah. I mean, if your internal GPS is constantly rendering a map that says you are driving off a cliff, how do you manage to go to school or hold down a job or, buy groceries?
Well, the system builds a wall, and this introduces the concept of the thermodynamics of structural dissociation.
Okay, big words.
I know, but it's simpler than it sounds. When a system is subjected to sustained external entropy and its protected boundaries are overwhelmed, it executes a survival-driven structural bifurcation.
Okay, so it divides itself.
Exactly. It divides itself to prevent the total collapse of its central modeling architecture.
It's a structural bifurcation. It sounds like quantum physics or advanced engineering, but we are literally talking about the architecture of human psychology.
We are.
Let's break down exactly how this wall gets built, because the sources describe two distinct phases of dissociation, right?
Yes. The first is phase A, which they term the acute blowout, or primary dissociation.
Acute blowout.
This occurs when a single, massive threat severely breaches the boundary. Imagine a sudden, horrifying car accident, an assault, or a natural disaster.
Something instantaneous and huge.
Right. The localized gating system, the salience network we discussed earlier, simply collapses under the sheer, incomprehensible volume of chaotic sensory
The
signals.
system is just flooded, a total circuit overload.
To survive this devastating surge, the system executes a somatic fuse blowout.
Just like a house electrical panel when lightning strikes.
Precisely. The prefrontal cortex drops offline entirely. The integration between sensory input and narrative meaning severs. The person might experience profound acute dissociation, feeling totally disconnected from their body, floating near the ceiling, or experiencing time stretching and slowing down.
I've heard people describe that like everything was in slow motion.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And crucially for our understanding of trauma, the traumatic event is not stored as ordinary semantic memory.
Meaning it's not stored like the memory of what you ate for breakfast or the plot of a movie you just watched.
Right. It's stored as raw, unintegrated, fragmented sensation within the amygdala and insula. Sights, sounds, smells, and somatic panic, totally stripped of chronological context.
So it's like a bunch of scrambled Polaroids and audio clips just scattered in a drawer, rather than a neat chapter written in a history book.
That is an excellent visualization. It is an emergency strategy. The system sacrifices narrative continuity in order to preserve immediate biological survival.
That makes perfect sense for a single acute event. The fuse blows, the threat passes, and eventually the system can attempt to slowly process those scattered Polaroids.
Yes, in a healthy recovery.
But what about phase B? Because the sources call this the structural partition or secondary and tertiary dissociation. This is what happens with the chronic, inescapable threat of complex trauma.
Right, because complex trauma demands a fundamentally different architectural solution. The threat does not end.
You can't just blow a fuse every day for 10 years.
No, a single fuse blowout isn't viable long term. The system cannot afford to remain permanently shut down. The child still has to go to school, they have to eat dinner, and they have to interact with the very people who might be causing the threat.
But simultaneously, the system cannot survive the continuous, unrelenting flooding of the self-model by this traumatic material. The DMN would completely shatter.
Exactly. It's an impossible paradox. You are required to keep functioning in reality, but the reality you are functioning in is psychologically intolerable.
So how does the brain solve an impossible paradox?
To resolve it, the system executes a mathematical bifurcation. It builds internal sub-boundaries to partition the central core into distinct operating systems.
Okay.
In clinical literature, this is referred to as structural dissociation of the personality. The system basically divides its resources into an apparently normal part, the ANP, and an emotional part, the EP.
Okay, I need to pause here and challenge this terminology.
Please do.
Because structural dissociation of the personality sounds dangerously close to, like, Hollywood depictions of multiple personality disorder. Are these papers suggesting that anyone with complex trauma literally has split personalities living in different physical lobes of their brain? Like, the left brain puts on a suit and goes to work as the ANT, and the right brain hides in a closet as the EP, because that sounds extreme for a general model of complex trauma.
I am so glad you challenged that because the sources dedicate significant effort to aggressively correcting that literal brain module myth.
Okay, good.
ANP and EP are not clean, discrete neural compartments. You will not find them separated by a physical fissure on an MRI scan.
So what are they?
They are clinical and phenomenological action system terms.
Phenomenological action system terms. Let's ground that. That means they describe how the system acts and how it experiences reality,
Right.
rather than representing distinct physical locations in the brain tissue.
Correct. Structural dissociation is a defense of the self-model's continuity. The system isn't protecting a specific lobe of the brain. It is protecting the narrative I from complete disintegration.
Right.
So the apparently normal part, the AMP, is the partitioned subcore dedicated to executing routine life tasks. Work, social presentation, biological maintenance.
The part of you that just gets through the day.
Exactly. It is a functional self-state that actively recruits executive control from the PFC. And to conserve energy and prevent collapse, the ANP's boundary selectively blocks all traumatic memories and somatic threat markers.
So the AMP basically operates in a state of high-functioning denial.
Essentially, yes.
It is the part that answers emails, makes small talk at the grocery store, and completely ignores the fact that the house is on fire. It avoids the traumatic material so life can keep moving forward.
And quarantined on the other side of that internal wall is the emotional part, the EP.
The EP.
The EP holds all the unintegrated traumatic memories, the raw autonomic threat loops, the intense survival reactions, the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response.
Oh, and it holds all the terrifying Polaroids.
Yes. The EP remains structurally frozen in historical time. It does not know the trauma is over. It only gets activated when external or internal cues breach the AMP's defensive boundary.
So the EP isn't a defective part of the person. It is, as the papers describe it, survival intelligence trapped in historical time.
Exactly. It's highly intelligent, just outdated.
Let's go back to our software metaphor for a second. The brain isn't physically split in two. Instead, the underlying operating system is running two distinct virtual machines. They share the same hardware, but they are completely sandboxed. They aren't allowed to share files. The ANP virtual machine has Excel and an email client open, and the EP virtual machine is running a constant, massive virus scan of a threat that happened 20 years ago.
Process sandboxing. Subsystem virtualization. That captures the mechanics flawlessly.
But what does it actively feel like to live inside a partitioned self-model like that? I mean, the sources don't mince words here. They describe this as the cognitive condition of hell.
Yeah.
Which is an incredibly strong word for a peer-reviewed scientific paper. They call it a closed high-entropy system.
It is a profound description, and it accurately reflects the lived internal experience. Because the traumatic material within the EP is quarantined, but completely unresolved, the default mode network becomes hyperactive and threat-organized.
Because it knows something is wrong, even if it's walled off.
Right. It is locked into a state of chronic vigilance. It continuously attempts to model and neutralize the unresolved threat. It replays the past obsessively.
It predicts danger in mundane interactions.
It simulates rejection before a conversation even begins. It interprets any minor bodily alarm as irrefutable evidence of present-day catastrophe.
So the body alarms, the DMN narrates it as an existential threat. The ego identifies with that narrative, and consciousness becomes trapped inside a self-story organized entirely around survival.
Exactly.
You might be walking around a perfectly safe office building, but your DMN is running hyper-realistic simulations of absolute ruin.
And this constant thrashing of the system's boundaries leads to a phenomenon the authors call epistemic amnesia.
Epistemic amnesia. Okay, let's unpack that carefully, because when I hear amnesia, I instantly think of a soap opera character forgetting their own name.
Right, waking up in a hospital with no memory.
Yeah, but in this context, it's something much deeper and honestly more insidious, isn't it?
It is. It is a loss of shared attentional equilibrium. Because the system's boundary is working relentlessly to maintain that structural partition between the ANP and the EP, present experience is no longer received cleanly. The individual loses the capacity to establish an unforced, neutral connection with the present moment. They lose the ability to trust their own process of knowing, which is what epistemic refers to.
Give me a concrete scenario of what epistemic amnesia looks like in an everyday relationship. Like, how does the past get fundamentally misread as the present?
Okay, imagine you are at home and your partner is washing the dishes and they let out a heavy sigh.
Just a normal sigh.
Right. In an unpartitioned, grounded system, your auditory cortex registers the sigh, your DMN cross-references it with present context, and you conclude, oh, my partner had a long day at work and they are tired.
You might ask if they want help.
Exactly. But for a partition system, that sigh is a massive trigger.
Right.
It breaches the boundary of the ANP. The emotional part, the EP, associates a heavy sigh with the precursor to a violent outburst from a childhood caregiver.
Oh, wow.
So the amygdala fires. The insula floods the body with dread. The DMN instantly captures this physiological data narrators. They are furious with me. I am in danger. I need to defend myself or hide.
So you aren't seeing reality as it actually is?
No, you are experiencing epistemic distortion.
Your inner world basically collapses into a hall of mirrors. You are reacting to a caregiver from 20 years ago, but you are projecting it onto your tired partner in the present moment.
And without that epistemic grounding, the system completely loses confidence in the difference between past and present, between internal somatic memory and external evidence.
And running this hall of mirrors requires a staggering amount of biological energy.
A phenomenal amount.
Which brings us to a crucial correction the sources make regarding the resource reservoir of the brain.
Yes, this is so important.
Because the old, crude model suggested that the prefrontal cortex literally ran out of glycogen and neurotransmitters when it tried to inhibit the amygdala.
Like a car physically running out of gas.
Right. Like you just ran out of willpower juice.
The concept of literal ego depletion as a simple fuel tank has been heavily scrutinized and pretty much discarded in these newer frameworks. Instead, they introduce a much more robust, systemic concept, allostatic load.
Let's define allostatic load, because this explains the profound, unexplainable exhaustion that traumatized individuals experience. You know, that fatigue that sleep just doesn't seem to cure.
Right. Allostatic load represents the cumulative energetic and physiological costs of repeatedly adapting to stress. Maintaining this structural partition, keeping the AMP functioning while actively suppressing the EP, consumes massive amounts of what they call regulatory bandwidth.
Regulatory bandwidth.
Under chronic trauma, the organism must maintain heightened readiness across multiple biological systems simultaneously. Autonomic arousal is elevated, the endocrine stress response is active.
Cortisol is probably pumping constantly.
Exactly. The immune system is on alert. Attention is constantly scanning for subtle threats. Emotional inhibition is running at maximum capacity to keep the trauma contained. All of these processes are running concurrently.
So going back to the software metaphor, they're literally consuming all the available RAM.
Yeah.
It is not that your brain is out of physical sugar. It's that your system's bandwidth is entirely consumed by massive background applications running a constant historical virus scan.
That's exactly what's happening.
So the fatigue isn't imaginary. It isn't laziness. It is the invisible, crushing allostatic burden of running a partitioned operating system with constant background alarms.
And when your allostatic load is that high, you simply have less available bandwidth for everything else. For curiosity, for creativity, for complex planning, for intimacy, and for learning.
The system is surviving, but it has no resources left to actually live.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of this deep dive. If willpower, logic, and prefrontal top-down control cannot fix this because, as we established at the very beginning, the PFC isn't the true identity core, how does a partition system ever heal?
Right. What's the way out?
If using force just drains more allostatic bandwidth, how do you get out of this cognitive condition of hell?
Well, the sources outline a path to reintegration. But again, they provide a major correction to traditional therapeutic thinking. They clearly delineate the false goal versus the true goal of integration.
Okay, let's start with the false goal. What are people instinctively trying to do that is guaranteed to fail?
The false goal is the belief that integration means forcing the emotional part, the EP, into submission using the prefrontal cortex.
Just bullying it into submission.
Yeah, or the idea that the apparently normal part, the ego, needs to forcefully dominate, silence, and eradicate the EP.
So the false goal is basically the AMP going to war with the EP and trying to win through sheer cognitive dominance. It's the person saying, I am going to logically crush my anxiety. I am going to outthink my panic.
Precisely. And the sources explicitly state that true recovery cannot be achieved through willpower, cognitive self-control, or therapeutic domination.
Why not?
Because those approaches just reproduce the exact same internal hierarchy of force and suppression that caused the structural dissociation in the first place. It is the misaligned controller trying to use top-down force while remaining completely blind to the invisible survival rules that dictated the partition.
That is incredibly profound. Trying to dominate your trauma actually reinforces the architecture of the trauma.
Exactly.
You are using the tools of the hostile environment against yourself.
Yes. So the true goal, what the text referred to as metanoia, is the reclassification of structure.
Metanoia.
Integration does not mean destroying the EP or silencing the body's alarms. Integration is improved communication across the network, where what was once encoded as present day existential danger becomes reclassified as historical memory.
The reclassification of structure. Okay, how does an individual actually achieve that in practice? Because the sources outline specific steps to achieving this structural collapse, but I want to make sure we ground them in reality.
Sure.
Step 1 is defined as stripping the egoic projection. What does that mean mechanically?
Mechanically, it means the system must stop identifying completely with its defensive postures. You have to stop identifying the self with the looping, catastrophic narrator of the DMN.
Okay.
You have to stop believing you are the numb, high-functioning facade of the AMP, and you must realize you are not the terrified, historical alarm of the EP.
It's stepping back and recognizing I am not my anxiety. I am not my relentless hyperproductivity. I am not my looping paranoid thoughts.
Exactly. You realize that the looping thoughts are just localized subroutines. You are the underlying operating system, not the crashed application.
I love that. You are the OS, not the app.
Exactly. The egoic narrator isn't destroyed. Its function is just recognized for what it actually is. It is seen as one organizing function within a much larger field of consciousness rather than the totality of your existence.
Which leads to step 2, isolating the mechanical skeleton. This is where the specific systems archaeology vocabulary becomes a highly practical tool, right?
It is utilizing this precise, objective, systems-based language to look at your own triggers and dissociation, not as moral defects, but as objective survival mechanics. You begin to view your reactions as topological configurations designed to protect your core identity.
I want to illustrate this because I feel like this step completely strips away the shame of trauma. Let's go back to the scenario where the partner sighs over the dishes.
Okay, yes.
The person gets triggered, their EP floods the system with panic, and they completely dissociate and space out. In the old model, they would feel immense shame. They would think, I am a broken, defective partner. I am weak because I can't even handle a simple sigh.
Right, tons of self-blame.
But if they are isolating the mechanical skeleton, what does that internal monologue sound like instead?
The internal monologue shifts to pure observation, it sounds like. My auditory cortex processed a sigh. My amygdala matched that acoustic pattern to a historical threat from my childhood. To protect my DMN from being overwhelmed by that historical terror, my system executed a mathematically precise survival protocol, a structural partition. It dropped my prefrontal executive function offline and initiated a freeze response to keep me safe. I am not a bad partner. My system simply misread the present environment and ran a brilliant, outdated defense algorithm.
You expose the mechanical skeleton, you recognize the pattern as architecture rather than a moral failure.
Exactly.
And according to the texts, when you can consistently observe the mechanics without shame or identification, you move to step 3, the collapse of the partition.
And notice the word choice there. It is a collapse.
Yeah.
You do not smash the partition down. You do not forcefully dismantle the wall.
Right.
Once the invisible rules sustaining the partition are exposed and reclassified, the defensive walls naturally collapse on their own because they are basically starved of the belief that they are still necessary.
The A&P no longer has to rigidly deny the EP to survive. The EP no longer has to hijack the entire system just to express its historical pain.
And most critically, the default mode network no longer has to narrate every single somatic sensation as an identity-level danger. It stops interpreting the self through the architecture of continuous threat.
What was once exiled as an intolerable, world-ending sensation becomes, just bearable, integrated bodily information.
Exactly. The system recognizes that a sigh is just a sigh. The historical virus scan finally completes and realizes there is no current virus.
And this leads to what the authors call effortless flow, metanoia. Because healing isn't about the brain going to war with itself and finally winning.
Right.
It's about the brain fundamentally realizing it doesn't need to be at war anymore.
And if we extrapolate on this idea of effortless flow, the implications are staggering. Integration isn't about building a new, perfect, healed self. You don't have to construct anything.
You're just removing the blocks.
Integration is the natural structural collapse of defensive walls when the storm has finally been recognized as past. And what happens when those walls fall? All of that metabolic energy, all of that immense allostatic bandwidth that was previously wasted on maintaining the partition, on suppressing the EP, on scanning for threats.
It's instantly freed up.
It is instantly freed up.
The RAM is cleared, the background applications are closed, the processor drops from 99% usage down to 5%.
The energy is conserved and immediately re-aimed toward unburdened present moment creation. The system stops fighting its own architecture. Intention moves into relation, connection, and action with zero wasted biological CPU cycles.
Wow.
It's the perfect circulation of an open, integrated system.
It is an incredibly hopeful framework. So let's briefly recount the vast territory we've covered today. Because we started by completely redrawing the map of the mind under pressure. We moved away from the flawed model that blamed the prefrontal cortex for a lack of logical self-control.
Right, we established the default mode network, the DMN, as the true prime identity core and the narrator of our lives, recognizing the PFC as merely the executive steering wheel.
And we discovered the true, profound nature of complex trauma. It is an identity capture event.
It isn't just about feeling fear.
No, it is the tragic process where the DMN folds inescapable threat into your very sense of self, making the environment of danger completely self-referential.
And we explored how the mind physically and mathematically partitions itself to survive that capture, building structural walls between the apparently normal part and the emotional part to protect the self-model from entirely shattering.
We looked at the exhausting lived reality of maintaining that partition, the epistemic amnesia where the past is constantly hallucinated as the present, and the massive allostatic load that drains our biological bandwidth just to keep the system running.
And finally, we redefined the concept of integration, not as forceful domination by a rational ego, but as the objective reclassification of structure, the effortless, shame-free collapse of obsolete defensive walls, freeing up metabolic energy for present moment flow.
It fundamentally changes how you view yourself and the people around you. It completely removes the stigma and the shame from psychological suffering.
It really does.
If you or someone you love is struggling with these invisible, exhausting internal wars, this research proves unequivocally that it is not a failure of willpower. It is not a flawed, weak personality.
It is a brilliant, self-organizing biological system, executing a flawless survival protocol for an environment it believes is still hostile.
It is the pinnacle of survival intelligence.
Absolutely. The architecture of the traumatized self is a profound testament to the human mind's incredible capacity to adapt, to partition, and to protect its core narrative, even under impossible thermodynamic pressure.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. We started by talking about that feeling of being hijacked, that murky, confusing moment where you react to a minor comment with absolute panic and you blame yourself for losing control.
Yeah.
But based on everything we've uncovered today about the default mode network, the insula, and the incredible sandboxed architecture of survival, if the parts of yourself that you have spent your whole life considering your deepest flaws, your anxieties, your emotional numbing, your intense overreactions, your hypervigilance are actually just your system's most brilliant, mathematically precise architectural solutions for surviving a past you haven't fully left behind. What happens to an entire sense of identity the moment you finally convince your DMN that the storm is over?